Welcome back to the 10-Second Film School. I'm Prof. Linus. Thanks for tuning in. This video compares the tropes and themes of two Tarantino films, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood and Pulp Fiction. Of course, there will be spoilers in this video, so if you haven't seen the films, watch them now and come back around later. I don't know what your theories are, but I am convinced that Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is somewhat of a thematic echo of Tarantino's second film, Pulp Fiction. There are so many similarities that I wonder if we can even call the latter movie the thematic sequel to the other. There used to be a GeoCities page that was maintained in the 90s that suggested pretty early on that Pulp Fiction is perhaps a Christian allegory. This isn't too far-fetched because there is such a strong connection to biblical lore in the film's opening and ending scenes. The site went on to say that the briefcase represented Marcellus' soul, which was taken from him, hence the band-aid on the back of his neck, and that Jules and Vincent are angels sent on a mission to retrieve said soul. Because of the film's heavy references to the music world, there's even another theory that suggests that the briefcase symbolizes rock and roll, and that the different characters are representations of different artists, Jules being Chuck Berry and Vincent being Elvis. But this video isn't going into the symbolism of characters, but going into a meditation on what these recurring images and ideas might mean, and a psychological scope into the mind who created such images. Let's talk about the genre of these two movies. These two movies are westerns. It's pretty obvious that Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is a western aesthetically due to its heavier reliance on iconography. But I would argue that Pulp Fiction has enough of the western's tropes in it to qualify as well. Pulp Fiction is a western not in the way that it looks necessarily, but in the interplay between the two main characters and their environment. Typically, westerns feature a thematic trope of a man, a tragic hero, wrestling with some kind of a moral problem. Like in the Oxbow incident, or 3:10 to Yuma, Jules does fit the description of a lone ranger, a man set apart from his environment, a world that he has become disillusioned by after living the hard life. Jules is comparable to Rick Dalton in Once Upon a Time. Rick, too, is a man set apart from his environment, and his lack of quality film work, coupled by feelings about his own abilities, make him question whether or not he is in the right place. Rick is actually working on a Western film within the movie, and does actually wear the Western garb while he is in a working situation, much like he's the symbolic sheriff of a small town represented by this film set. Let's talk quickly about the clothing choices in both films. Remember at the start of Pulp Fiction, before Jules and Vincent do their job, we can see that they are wearing similar looking suits, their work uniforms. Later, when the two characters finish their job together, they are forced to change their clothes into more civilian attire, as if they were, quote, on the way to a volleyball game. They no longer need to carry their burdens and responsibilities, and are thus dressed down to match. This echoes the relationship between work attire and casual attire in Once Upon a Time, where both Rick and Cliff wear costumes while they're at work. Remember when Cliff is wearing this getup in the Bruce Lee scene? It's never really detailed why he's dressed that way. Of course, at the end of the film, they are not in work clothes like they had been for the first 75% of the movie. Cliff is wearing more chilled out attire, and Dalton is in a bathrobe. Western movies usually deal with the interplay between good and evil, not just in the depictions of city worlds and the good guy bad guy gunfights, but westerns deal with the good and evil within the characters' hearts, and by extension, ourselves as viewers. Both Vince and Cliff serve a very interesting function in the life of the main protagonist. They are both proverbial devils on the shoulder to their best friends, Jules and Rick. Vince has an interesting past that's different from his partner's, and he has something to teach Jules. Cliff also has an interesting past and challenges Rick with a new way of looking at things. I think the interplay between these characters is more than just coincidental or subconscious. Western movies don't just deal with violence or depict violence, but often the injuries sustained by the protagonists are themselves a motif in Western folklore. Both Vincent Vega and Cliff Booth not only live very violent lives, but they are the targets of violence. And it makes sense that these characters become injured at some point in their respective films. Injury can be seen as the externalization of the turmoil the characters feel on the inside. And both Vincent and Cliff definitely struggle with something internal that they are unable to express. Injury can also be seen as symbolic of male obsolescence, which is a major theme of westerns. Vincent is aging, tubby, and losing his touch with his work. Cliff is the same way. He is shown to be a sought-after stuntman in the past, but now spends most of his time sitting on a golf cart, being useless, getting fired, and languishing in his rundown trailer. In Western movies, there can be this trope of the damsel in distress that either isn't saved or isn't seen as living happily ever after with the protagonist. Think about My Darling Clementine. Westerns are darker and more tragic in the romance department, and because both Pulp Fiction and Once Upon a Time are pretty dark films romantically speaking, this too supports the idea that both are westerns. Mia Wallace in Pulp Fiction and Sharon Tate in Once Upon a Time are similar damsel in distress characters, and neither of them end up with the heroes of the film. While not in an identical manner, they are both scarily close to dangerous situations in both films, and are rescued directly or indirectly by astonishing forces outside of them. Mia has her brush with death, and is saved through miraculous, almost divine power, yet she does not end up with Vincent. The character of Sharon Tate comes very close to losing her life, only to be saved through unexplained divine intervention, and she doesn't end up with the hero of the film either. I also think it's interesting that in both movies, feminine sexuality is externalized through the art of dance. At the end of many westerns, there is often a shot of an important character riding off into the sunset, or at least walking off into the sunset. The idea of walking off into the distance or walking off frame suggests that the character is marching off to an unknown future. There is an irresolute feeling that comes from a typical Western ending. Sure, the film is ended, but we don't get the same feeling of closure as we might in a non-Westerns film. In both Pulp Fiction and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, in their respective last shots, a character walks off frame to an uncertain future. I think that's pretty beautiful. To a lesser degree, Westerns have and can deal with depictions of substance abuse. A big motif in Westerns is the negative effects of alcohol, for instance. Tarantino chooses to evoke similar motif in the form of illicit drugs in both of his movies. Both films deal with drug use and its effects, like the drugs are part of the plot insofar as how a character deals with its effects. We can usually expect some kind of a shootout or heist gone wrong in a typical Western. Well, in Pulp Fiction and Once Upon a Time, both films feature a home invasion gone wrong. There are basically two home invasions in Pulp Fiction. You could make the argument that Western-style mayhem ensues in both films during the home invasion scene that is brutal in a way that evokes a traditional bank robbery or a stagecoach attack. Anyone who knows a bit of Tarantino's history and his work will know about his love for the great film Rio Bravo. This Western is one of my favorites too, but it's not just a great Western, it's somewhat of an unusual Western. I made a whole video a few years ago about this film, which I'll link in the comments area below. But in a nutshell, Rio Bravo deals with something rather explicitly that is only hinted at or barely touched on at all in classical Hollywood-era Westerns. And that is the motif of homosexuality as a feature of the Western hero. In Pulp Fiction, Vinny Vega asks Jules if he'd ever give a guy a foot massage in the hallway before their first job together. This is played off for laughs, of course, but the important thing is that Jules takes Vincent seriously enough to flat out turn him down. Vincent's love is not returned. At the end of the movie, the two men are seen sharing a meal together as if on a date. And while the conversation is not sexual, this date posture is mimicked in the fact that Pumpkin and Honey Bunny are in an adjacent booth, sort of on a date themselves. Homosexuality is more dealt with handily in Once Upon a Time. This film is essentially a love story between Cliff Booth and Rick Dalton. Cliff's love is also unrequited, and he only expresses his love for Rick in speech at the end of the film as he is transported to the hospital. But there are many clues that attest to Cliff being symbolically gay. Cliff Booth is a consoling personality. He is there to make Rick feel better about his life and his career, even though he's basically in the same boat. He and Rick have two date scenes together, one at Musso and Frank's and the other at Casa Vega. In the first one, Cliff is clearly in the position of ensuring that Rick doesn't fall apart. He even offers him his sunglasses. After they have their drinks, which by the way are feminine drinks, a Bloody Mary and a whiskey sour, they proceed immediately to Rick's house. In screwball comedies and film noirs of the 40s and 50s, if two characters share a drink, and the very next scene takes place at one of their respective homes, there's an implication of sex. The only time we see Cliff in a relationship with a woman is the single flashback with Rebecca Gayheart on the boat, a woman that he purportedly kills. There's nothing sexual going on between them. And also in the script, her name is Billy Booth, Billy being kind of a boy's name. Perhaps she was his beard. Then cut to the scenes with Cliff and Pussycat, the Margaret Qualley character. Pussycat throws herself at Cliff repeatedly, and Cliff doesn't reciprocate in any way. He turns her down over and over, makes a big deal about her age. It actually looks like it's quite easy for him to resist her. And at the end of the film, when Cliff runs into Tex in a semi-recreation of the Manson murders, Tex asks if there is anyone else in the house, and Cliff only mentions Francesca in the bedroom and does not tell the intruder that Rick is in the backyard. Could this have been part of Cliff's subconscious desire to protect Rick? It could very well be that both men are straight, but coded homosexual undertones are a fixture in Hollywood movies, and has been for a very long time. And we know that Quentin knows what he's doing as a filmmaker. On top of that, we know what sorts of films he watches and references. In a movie where Cliff's relationship with Rick is described in voiceover, as one closer than that of brothers, but little less than a wife, is it not plausible that they have a relationship that is closer than friends? If you enjoyed this mini lecture, be sure to hit subscribe and follow me using the social media links you see on the screen. I'm at 10 Second Film on TikTok, Facebook, and Reddit, and 10 Second Film School on Instagram. If you wish to provide more support, you can help by purchasing a copy of my textbook, A Film Theorist's Companion, released by Cognella Academic Publishing. The second edition officially launches in October. The second edition has the blue cover on it. I'm very excited to share this with you, so please check out the link in the description below. You can also find me on Patreon, patreon.com/10 Second Film. Your contributions will go so far to helping me make more videos for this channel. Thank you so much in advance. This is Linus from the 10 Second Film School, and I will see you next time.